Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Leanna if you're new, and welcome to episode 10 of Makeup and Mythology, a series I'm doing on my channel where I do my makeup and also tell you an ancient myth. For episodes 1 through 9, I did Greek myths, and this episode is going to be the first non-Greek myth that I'm covering, which is that of Sekhmet, the Egyptian goddess of revenge, plagues, war, and healing. Ooh. Definitely, if there are any specific myths from any culture that you want me to cover, leave them down in the comment section below. But yeah, for this episode, we're doing Sekhmet. So if you didn't know, Egyptian gods and goddesses are depicted with animal heads. This is to depict in symbolism the personality of that particular god or goddess. So Sekhmet is primarily depicted with the body of a woman and the head of a lioness, because lions are ferocious and she is supposed to be ferocious, so I think that's pretty straightforward. So basically her story goes like this. Once there was a god, Ra. And Ra was the sun god, the giver of life, and he gave mankind a set of rules to follow. Maintain justice, worship me, don't be assholes. Simple enough, right? But no, apparently it's not possible. So, they broke his rules, and he was really upset about it. So he wanted to punish them. And so what he did was he reached into his eye and pulled out the Uraeus cobra that transformed into a lioness. And thus Sekhmet was born. So this is why she is considered to be the Eye of Ra, or born from the Eye of Ra. And the eye itself is actually a symbol of Ra's destructive side, which is referring to the sun's massive heat and the destruction that it can cause. So the Uraeus cobra from which Sekhmet transformed is actually something she wears on her head as a headdress, along with the solar disk, which associates her with the sun god and royalty. So anyway, Ra was like, okay, Sekhmet, go down to the earth and go punish those heathens for me. Go destroy the humans. And so she did, and she kind of went crazy in her bloodlust and killed a lot of people. And Ra actually started to feel bad about it, and he tried to call her off, but she ignored him because she was so driven by her bloodlust. So Ra was like, okay, fine, you want some blood? I'll give you some blood. So in an effort to subdue her, he mixed beer with this substance called hematite, which is a reddish-black mineral, and he put that mixture into the Nile River, coloring it red as blood, and he flooded the nearby fields with this water. And it turns out Sekhmet was rather quite literally bloodthirsty, because she saw the fields covered in what she thought was blood, and she got really excited, so she decided to drink it all. And so because it was beer, she got really drunk and knocked out for several days. And when she finally woke up several days later, her bloodlust diminished and humanity was spared. So a lot of sources consider her and the goddess Hathor to be connected, two aspects of the same goddess, where Sekhmet represented the more violent and bloodthirsty side, and Hathor represented a more gentle side. So a lot of sources say that when Sekhmet woke up from her drunken state, she woke up as Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility. And when she woke up as Hathor, justice was restored again. Egyptian mythology really likes to kind of group some similar gods and goddesses into one entity. So like how Hathor and Sekhmet are kind of considered two aspects of the same goddess, another aspect is Bastet, who some sources say is Sekhmet's sister, but some other sources just consider another side of Sekhmet herself. Bastet, similar to Hathor, was very gentle. She was the goddess of sunrise, music, dance, and she was a protectress of women, children, and domestic cats. This gentler aspect of Sekhmet kind of came into existence because at one point Lower Egypt lost a war with Upper Egypt, so she just kind of came to be seen as a domestic cat as opposed to a fierce lioness. Bastet does have the head of a cat. Although they were less fierce than lions, cats in ancient Egypt were still regarded as very sacred creatures. And they were considered so because they protected the crops and killed the rodents, which were responsible for spreading disease. So Bastet's story is that she rides through the sky every day with her father Ra, and she's his protector. At night, she would turn into a cat to protect her father from his greatest enemy, the serpent Apep, who was the deity of chaos and the opponent to literally everything good in the world. He is associated with natural disasters and death, and is sometimes linked to the god Set, the god of chaos and disorder. I find it interesting how so many cultures have gods that are just like responsible for all the bad stuff, like, oh, this is this god's fault. This god is the reason why, there is pain and suffering in the world. But anyway, back to the main story. Sekhmet, when she awoke from her drunken state, the first thing she saw was the handsome god Ptah, who is said to be the husband of Bastet. So, there you go. Bastet, Sekhmet, same person. Or maybe he was just married to the both of them. Ptah was the creator of things, a craftsman, similar to Hephaestus in Greek mythology. So Sekhmet was completely enamored by Ptah because he was super handsome, and they got together, and they got married, and they banged, and they made a son named Nefertum, who was born from a blue lotus bud floating in the water, representing the sunrise. Later in time, the architect Imhotep, who was a real person, was named Sekhmet's son, or according to some sources, considered her adopted son. Imhotep worked under the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Djoser, and he's considered to be responsible for building the very first step pyramid. And Imhotep was called the son of Ptah, which I'm guessing is because he was an architect and Ptah was like the creator of things, god. And after his death, Imhotep became worshipped as a god, probably because his contribution to Egyptian architecture was so monumental. So that's pretty much the story of Sekhmet. I was unable to find any other stories with her in it, really. Definitely not as easy as finding stuff on Greek mythology, just because, everyone is so focused on Greek mythology, so that's definitely going to be a challenge when it comes to finding myths from other cultures, but that's okay. I think this story is just meant to explain the heat of the sun, and, plagues, and especially the annual reddening of the Nile due to the silt coming from upstream and the flooding of the fields. So this is another example of an ancient culture using a myth to explain natural phenomena, similar to how the Greeks came up with the story of Hades and Persephone to explain why there was winter. I think it's definitely really interesting. I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit more about Sekhmet herself. She was a symbol of absolute power and authority. She was said to breathe fire, and the hot winds of the desert were like her breath. And she was also considered to be a protector of pharaohs in life and death. So when a pharaoh died, she would lead them into the afterlife. She could cause plagues and end them with incantations and magic spells, just all around a very powerful goddess. Now for a mini history lesson, in ancient times they actually held a religious festival called the Festival of Drunkenness, or the Festival of Intoxication, and this was held in the beginning of the calendar year. They danced, lit candles, and played music, all in the honor of the goddess, and drank great quantities of wine to imitate the extreme drunkenness that stopped her from destroying all the humans. So this festival wasn't much of a social event more than it was a sacred affair, and its purpose was to honor her and worship her so that she wouldn't destroy them. She was rather feared, and for good reason, because, she almost obliterated everyone. These rituals were also performed with the hope that those who worship Hathor/Sekhmet will receive an epiphany from her. Now, it is said that the participants of this sacred festival engage in sex orgies as a way of celebrating the goddess, so that's rather fun. Speaking of sex, this makes me think of learning about this in history class in school, but pharaohs used to publicly masturbate into the Nile River as a sacred act to bring prosperity to the people and also fertility to the land. So everybody would just stand around, as the pharaoh would do his thing. It was very natural for the people who lived in the lands by the Nile to consider sex and masturbation as a sacred, meaningful act. This is evident in the myth of Atum, the creator god, who has a lot of similarities with Ra, actually. So it was said that before there was anything in the world at all, Atum was surrounded by nothingness, and he was all alone. And he wanted to change this, so he masturbated, and from his semen sprouted the world and the rest of the Egyptian gods. So masturbation was his act of creation. And this view of sex as something sacred is so unlike the views in societies influenced by Christian morals. I feel like I'm pretty open about talking about sex and stuff, but even still a lot of our society is just like, no, sex is taboo. So if you caught me laughing while I was explaining this, it's not because it was funny, but just because I'm uncomfortable. But yeah, I think it's definitely really interesting to learn about, and it kind of makes you rethink the stigmas around sex that are put in place by Christian moral influenced societies. So on that note, that is pretty much all I had for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one. Bye!